Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming out here today to join me. As you know, I've spent the last 4 years running a very long and hard campaign against giant, massive comic book events. This evil has been tainting comic books for far too long now, but today I am happy to announce that we have won. Yes, that's correct. Comic book fans have come out here and they have spoken and made their voices clear, and they have said no more comic book events. Now, okay, I know that some people out there in the fake media, boo, hiss, everyone boo and hiss the fake media. I know someone is going to say that comic book events still sell incredibly well and that comic book sales in general have been increasing over the past couple of years, but there's a reason why people think this. It's because those comic book sales numbers are fake. There are plenty of illegal books out there that are being counted that should not actually add up. And I know that when you count the real legal comic book sales numbers, you will see no one actually likes events anymore and everyone agrees with me. And no, I will not provide any actual evidence for anything that I just said. You're an idiot! Who said that? Who said that? Well, hey, you know what? If I was a gross incompetent boob who couldn't even do numbers correctly, then could I possibly have booked this press conference at the fabulous Four Seasons Hotel? Check and mate. Didn't expect the porn store, the crematorium to be across the street from the Four Seasons, but I guess they did some renovations. Anyway, my point still stands. That giant, massive comic book events are done. No one is reading them anymore, and you would have to be crazy to believe that people are.
Folks, giant comic book events are still a huge chunk of the ever-expanding comic book world and still sell big numbers, and only people that don't know math or how to book a hotel would argue otherwise. Yes, I'll admit I fought against comic book events long and hard, but eventually you just have to admit that you've lost, and this is just how things are, and it's probably the way things are going to be forever. I remember in the mid-2000s when Marvel put out House of M, followed by Civil War, and then followed right after that by World War Hulk, everyone said, okay, this is just the current comic book landscape. This is how things are now, but it's another trend, and trends eventually end. So the day and age of giant, massive comic book events that change everything will eventually come to an end as well. But normally a trend lasts for max around 10 years, and we are now 15 years into the giant, massive events age, and it has no sign of ending. That means there is someone out there who is turning 30 years old this year, who has spent more than half of their life reading comics, who never knew what comic books were like back before everything was one major event after another and tie-ins among tie-ins among tie-ins. So yeah, this might just be the way things are now. Comics will never go back to the way they were with more standalone stories, and honestly, I might have preferred things back before it was one massive event after another, but this is how things are, and I've come to accept it. Comics are a constantly changing landscape, and you can't spend your entire life saying, well, back in my day, things were better. Eventually, you have to learn to say, it's been 15 years now, this is just how things are, and then you either live with it or you decide to check out. Now, don't get me wrong. Just because I said I've accepted that this is the way things are, doesn't mean that there aren't still problems with giant, massive comic book events. Far from it. A few years ago, I did a video basically asking Marvel to lay off the comic events, and in all that time, pretty much all of my complaints still stand. Real talk, I could probably just link you guys to that video, tell you to go watch it, and then call it a day. However, I do feel like that video needs a bit of a refresher because I feel like there are some things about current comic book events that have changed. Some for the better and some for the worse. Let's start with the better. Back when I made that video, Marvel had multiple giant crossover events going all at once. Now, Marvel tends to focus mostly on one at a time. Granted, as soon as one event ends, they immediately go into the next one, and that is a problem not allowing your audience time to breathe, but holy cow, is it still better than having 3 giant events happening all at once. Now, I know that someone right now is about to say that Marvel does have multiple events going on all at the same time, but that's because a lot of people out there confuse events for storylines. You see, a storyline is a story that can certainly be big, it can certainly affect a lot of books, but it tends to go from part 1 to part 2 to part 3 and so on all across a series of books in one easy to follow order. An event is a story that has its own title based around the story, then it has tie-ins in other established series, then it will have tie-ins in brand new series all built around that story, launching multiple other series all at the same time, hardly any of those officially falling into any specific spot of the main story itself, meaning maybe you do have to read it or maybe you don't. You see the difference between a storyline and an event? Events, while having existed since the 80s, didn't become a big driving force in comics until the mid-2000s, while storylines have always been the primary story mode of comics. And yet, I can't blame people for looking at storylines and thinking they're events, because comic companies still advertise storylines the same way that they advertise events. They say things will never be the same, everything will change, countdowns serving as prequels to these stories. Heck, we have even gotten to the point where simple storylines that are meant to focus on one title will now have 0.1 or half issues that aren't technically tie-ins, but they sure feel like them. And these storylines continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger until even if they don't have tie-ins, they still feel like events. So yes, there are fewer events now, but it doesn't always feel like that because storylines are now being advertised the same way that we used to advertise events. However, I can't exactly blame comic book companies for advertising their storylines like this because, well, hey man, it's worked for events for over a decade now. Advertising events this way brings in readers, so why not advertise everything else the exact same way? But when you advertise storylines the way that you advertise events, it now adds to this overwhelming feeling like there are too many events, thereby adding to the event fatigue, which yes, is indeed a real thing. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, yes, there have been fewer events over the last few years, it just doesn't feel like it because storylines now feel like events. So we'll chalk this one up to being a half improvement? But there are certain elements of current comic book events that we can definitely point at and say that they are better than the way things used to be. The most important one to me being that when I made that video years ago, comic events almost seemed random. It felt like Marvel had to have a certain number of events every single year, and that didn't give them time to set anything up. So these huge, massive, universe-altering events just sort of popped up out of nowhere. Remember when Nick Fury killed the Watcher because he just did? Yeah, the Watcher. You know, this major staple of the Marvel Universe who had been there for all these huge moments in their history. Let's just decide to kill him off for no reason at all other than the fact that we need to have a thing happen right now. Or what about Civil War II, which just decided to come along and screw over pretty much every single other book out there at Marvel at the time, ruining several characters' relationships and story arcs that they had been building over the course of several issues, all because a random new character appeared out of nowhere. Yeah, events just happening, just so that we could have an event, was the norm for a few years, and it led to a comic book landscape where it felt like nothing mattered because at any moment a story could be interrupted and character developments could be undone just so we could have an event that nobody asked for and didn't matter a year later. But over the past few years, we've seen a change. Sure, there are still pop-up events that change books with no build-up, such as the current Outlawed event, an event so forgettable that despite the fact it's affecting multiple books I'm reading right now, I still had to stop and look up the name of it. However, most of these recent big events now actually have a decent amount of build-up to them. War of the Realms was built up to over the course of 7 years. Absolute Carnage is what Donny Cates' Venom series has been leading up to since it started, and now the upcoming King in Black event is the conclusion to that. Even the smaller events that feel like they come out of nowhere, like Empire, was the continuation of Hulkling's story that had been building up over his last few appearances. So even if there wasn't anything directly leading into it, it was a story that eventually had to be confronted, so it's not too bad. By the way, quick side note, Hulkling, please change your name. Why are you still using that? point is, because these events are no longer as spontaneous and they're actually led into, they actually feel more natural. It feels less like Marvel is coming in here and just shoving a new event in your face because we have to have one, and it feels more like this is just how the story was supposed to go. It feels more like the natural direction of the book. And as we have seen from the reviews of these books, it's actually paid off. Surprise, surprise, when you have a storyline that is led up to and people actually know the stakes behind it and everything feels like it was planned out, people will respond more positively to it. It will no longer feel like change for the sake of change, but change for the sake of a story. Change that was earned. And this has been one of the biggest problems of event books over the last decade. They would come out of nowhere, change everything, and affect a ton of other books that people have been reading, completely shutting down ongoing stories for something totally unrelated, preventing readers from growing attachments to these books. Which is the other way that events have actually improved over the past few years. Let's be honest, tie-in issues are sometimes cool. If it's a good event and you're enjoying it and you're not that attached to the current storyline of the book that you were following, it can be fun to see what a character is doing during an event. And they can also use these tie-in events to expand upon information left out of the main storyline. However, 9 times out of 10, when a book has a tie-in, it pretty much just interrupts the story that you were already reading, so that way it can basically force you to decide, do I skip this issue, or do I now have to read the big main event book so I can understand what the heck is going on? But over the past few years, I've noticed that while, yes, there are still plenty of crossover tie-ins in ongoing series, far more tie-in books now exist as their own miniseries. And while the number of these tie-in miniseries can be astronomically absurd at times, they are now their own books, meaning that your series is less likely to be interrupted. When we talked about the big event Absolute Carnage on this site, I complained a fair amount about how many tie-in books there were for that event. However, one of the tie-in books was for Miles Morales, a series that I was really enjoying, and I am happy to say that was just a tie-in book. It did not tie into the main ongoing Miles Morales series, and I have noticed this trend continuing with other giant crossover events. Again, it does still happen. There are still event books that tie into ongoing series, interrupting the storylines that they had already been building. Just look over at oh geez, I said it just a moment ago. Lawless, Lone Star, Onboard? No, Outlawed, that was it. Yes, Outlawed is tying into Miss Marvel and Miles Morales, and we just saw Empire did tie into a couple of other major ongoing series. However, it isn't happening as much. More titles are being left alone by big events. It used to be that if a big event came around, almost every book out there had to tie into it. And if your title didn't tie into Giant Event A, then it was going to tie into Giant Event B or Giant Event C. It would be next to impossible to read an ongoing series for more than a year without it tying into at least something. But today, you can actually read some titles for whole years in a row without it being interrupted by any other crazy event BS. However, just because things have gotten better doesn't mean that old problems, or for the sake of this video, brand new problems, don't still exist. And there's one big problem that we need to address right after this quick indie book recommendation.
Yes, hi there everyone. Sorry to come in here and interrupt me talking with more me talking, but on this channel we used to come in here every now and again and do videos specifically dedicated to recommending indie books because I believe that it is important to focus on titles outside of the big two and help support smaller creators. However, those videos never did as well as our videos about, let's say, Batman or the Joker or Batman Joker or Joker Batman. Oh my god, TC, seriously, this is just freaking ridiculous. At this point, you need some help. Anywho, as I was saying, so I decided that in order to get more people focusing on indie books, I would no longer make those recommendations their own videos. Instead, I would put those recommendations at the end of every single one of our major videos. But I started thinking about it, and I realized, you know what would get even more people to talk about smaller indie books and more people focusing on these titles? If I didn't wait until the end of the video, and instead, I just sprinkled them in here randomly during these big videos, so that way, you guys wouldn't know what to skip. Oh yeah, we're going to do this now. Is it cruel and manipulative? Yeah, probably. Does it get more people focusing on smaller titles? Yes, and that's really all that I care about. So yes, our indie recommendations are no longer going to come at the end of all of our episodes. They are now going to be sprinkled randomly in the middle of our comic class videos. And for today's episode, we are going to focus on the newest book from Aubrey Sitterson. And if that name sounds familiar to you, is because he was the writer behind No One Left to Fight, which was one of our top 10 books of the year last year. That book was phenomenal. And for his newest title, he is taken to Kickstarter. He has a Kickstarter campaign going on right now, and I will link to it in the description down below. And his newest series is called Beef Bros. Now, aside from having one of the best titles for a book I have ever heard, this series is about two muscle-headed gym bros who have decided that they're going to go out there and save the world. Not from supervillains, but from the establishments that have corrupted us and caused us to turn away from our fellow man. In the pitch video for Beef Bros, which, by the way, might be one of the best pitch videos I have ever seen. Seriously, go to the link down below, watch that pitch video. Do yourself that favor. You've had a rough week, you owe yourself something fun. Watch that pitch video. But in that pitch video, he talks about how he was a huge fan of superheroes. But over the years, superheroes have changed. Superheroes are no longer about helping people, they're more about upholding the status quo. They can't really tackle some of the big issues out there that really are damaging our society, because a lot of superheroes today are owned by giant massive corporations, and they don't want to rock the boat in any way, and hoo boy was he right about that. So that is basically going to be the pitch of Beef Bros. It is two guys who they just want to do good, and they're actually tackling some of the things that need to change in our society in order for us to, do good. So in the preview pages that they put out, it shows the Beef Bros, the titular Beef Bros, going into an alleyway where a homeless man is being harassed by two police officers, and they go in there and they stop the cops, and then they turn to the homeless man, and he says that, yeah, this is where I live. And one of the Beef Bros says to him, "What? You don't have a place to live? But there's so many empty apartments." And then one of the other Beef Bros says, "Hey man, how about you come and you live with us for a while until you get back on your feet, or for as long as you want." And the other Beef Bro is just like, "That's a great idea, bro!" And I can't tell you the level of joy that it filled me with just seeing two guys who didn't even have to stop and think about helping their fellow man. Just seeing two guys out there tackling such a real situation, but with that level of optimism and hope and actually the desire to do better that I don't really see in a lot of superhero books out there. It just, I can just feel like my heart just like lifting back up just thinking about those pages. So yeah, Beef Bros, check it out in the description down below. It's already past its Kickstarter goal, so the book's already getting made. So if you can't afford to donate anything right now, hey man, I understand, money is tight for everyone right now, absolutely understand that. However, I still think it is worth checking this thing out and raising awareness about. I would love it if more people started talking about this. So yes, again, that is Beef Bros. Check it out in the description down below. Now back to whatever the hell we were talking about. All I can think about right now is Beef Bros.
When I look at the current landscape of events, there are certainly several problems that continue to pop out to me, but there is one problem that stands out more than anything else: the need to go bigger. Last week, a new series from Image Comics called Crossover came out, which was all about a comic book crossover event that got so big, it actually broke free of the world of comics and crossed over into our world. Was the book any good? It's by Donny Cates and Jeff Shaw, so of course it's good. I bring this up not to talk about crossover, but because this book is clearly meant to be making commentary on the current state of crossover events in comics, about how the size of them just simply isn't sustainable anymore. And don't get me wrong, comic book events have been trying to be massive and world-changing for over a decade now. Every event loves to say things will never be the same, everything is going to change forever, because that way it makes this event feel like the biggest, most important moment in the history of comics. And again, I do think over the past few years, Marvel has been a little better about this, with events that focus less on everyone and more on specific corners of their universe, making these events feel big but only for specific characters, which makes the impact feel more important. However, they're not the only ones who do massive crossover events. Yes, this entire time I've been focusing on Marvel because, well, they have kind of declared themselves to be the king of bloated, unnecessary events over the last decade. But DC also had a handful of memorable events here or there over this time. But in the past few years, they have gone nuts. It's actually kind of interesting how the moment that Marvel finally started to slow down their events, DC decided to pick up the pace. Almost as if someone who had been working at Marvel and who had been behind many of the giant, massive, unnecessary events over the past decade suddenly just picked up and moved over to DC. I don't know, did anything like that happen? I'm sure I'm just being crazy and making this up. I'm just spouting gibberish out of my mouth. Pay no attention to me. And each event at DC has been bigger and bigger, to the point where it has become obscene. This is actually the trajectory of DC's events over the past 3 years. The DC universe was invaded by monsters from the Dark Multiverse, an entire collection of worlds made up of the worst dreams of the DC heroes come to life, leading to one of the biggest threats they'd ever faced in the Dark God Barbatos, a battle that ended with the destruction of the Source Wall, one of the biggest events in DC's history, only to learn that there were 4 giant creatures behind the Source Wall, and each of them were stronger than Barbatos, and then they were able to beat these giant creatures, only to reveal that they were spawned by Perpetua, the god of the multiverse, who was even stronger than those 4 creatures who were stronger than Barbatos, and she went on to destroy the whole multiverse, only for the Batman Who Laughs to then become more powerful than Perpetua, who was more powerful than the Source Wall creatures, who were more powerful than Barbatos, before our heroes even got a chance to face Perpetua. They had been building this character up for a year, and we didn't even get to see anything happen with her because, too bad, we're already on to the next even bigger thing. Dear God, you know you have to eventually stop getting bigger, right? Eventually there is no more up. Eventually, this is even bigger than the last thing. Stops meaning anything. Why do I care if the Batman Who Laughs is stronger than Perpetua now, when we got rid of Perpetua before we even got to see her do anything? I mean, look at this cover. This was the cover to the latest issue of Dark Knight's Death Metal, and it kind of sums up exactly what I'm talking about. Here we see an evil Batman who turned into the Joker from the Dark Multiverse, now wielding the power of Dr. Manhattan after absorbing the power of the previous 3 giant crisis events to make himself stronger than the god of the multiverse, who never even got a chance to do anything before getting shoved to the side for this god Joker Batman hybrid wearing a Venom symbiote. And yes, I know that's not actually the Venom symbiote, but it's black with sharp teeth, a long tongue, and 90s aesthetics up the wazoo. It's totally the Venom symbiote. This image right here is the living embodiment of we must top the last thing until it gets to a point where it's just preposterous. Let's zoom in on this one part in particular. He's licking the button from the Watchmen, which is now frowning because, hey, take that, Watchmen, we're bigger and scarier than you were. Yeah, remember when the Watchmen crossed over into the DC universe, and that was supposed to be the cause of everything that had gone wrong over the past 5 years? And then remember how we spent over a year building up to the big confrontation between Superman and Dr. Manhattan with the fate of all reality in the balance? And this was all treated as something so big it was a once-in-a-lifetime event? Yeah, it's literally been less than a year since that story wrapped up, and not only do we now have a new crossover event that is also recreating the multiverse, just like the Watchmen event did, meaning this event is completely undoing all of that, but we're now turning to that thing that was meant to be treated as so big it was a once-in-a-lifetime event that everyone said was crazy, and we're practically mocking it. We're practically saying, ha, look at how much bigger we are than you, thing that was so big we should probably have only done it once. I repeat, it took a year to get to the point where we are now dunking on the previous once-in-a-lifetime biggest thing that we've ever done storyline. And that's just the stuff that has to do with the Dark Multiverse and the Watchmen. That's not even getting into all the stuff out there that felt like it was going to change everything, but now is so small compared to everything else that's happened just years after it, it barely feels like a blip on our radar. Does anybody remember Leviathan? Raise your hand if you remember Leviathan. Some of you are lying. And it's not just DC and their obsession with rebooting their multiverse over and over and over again. As I said, credit where credit is due. Marvel has gotten better over the past few years, but they were still on this trajectory as well. This was eventually what they were heading towards, and I'm glad that they pumped on the brakes, but they have suffered a lot of consequences from trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger and outdo themselves every single time. I mean, for crying out loud, does anyone remember when the Infinity Stones used to matter? Remember when if someone showed up with the Infinity Stones, it meant the end of the world? Now I think Loki is just keeping them in his dresser next to an ironic t-shirt in his sock collection. So, what is the status of comic book crossover events? What is the current state of them? Well, I can say that yes, they have gotten better. I think a few years ago, we were about to reach a breaking point, and we have now started to turn away from that. But they're not going away. In fact, I think we're about at the point they're going to remain for a while, where we only have one at a time, and we have other giant storylines that aren't events, but they still kind of feel like them. And honestly, as long as they don't keep screwing over too many other series, as long as most of their tie-ins remain contained to standalone miniseries or the books that the events actually spawn from, and as long as these events actually have build-up to them, well, look, I'm not going to say that they're all okay. There will be those series that have problems, but I think that we can live with this. Or more accurately, I think we can keep going about our business and mostly ignoring the ones that we want nothing to do with while enjoying the ones that we are curious about. But even then, there are still lessons to learn. These companies are still trying to go too big too often. They're trying to change too much too fast, and it creates a landscape where events being big and changing things no longer mean anything. But again, there is hope. We are getting better. Sometimes even if something isn't what you want, even if it isn't perfect, it is still worth celebrating when you come so close to being the absolute worst case scenario, and then you're able to successfully turn away from that. And when it comes to comic book crossover events, I think it's safe to say that while we're never going to be fully done with them and they will always have problems, we were able to avoid the worst case scenario.
Okay, guys, I know I screwed up with the 4 seasons, but it's okay, because for the big finale to the episode today, I was able to book us a room at the world famous, damn it! It's a bunch of crackers! Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Well, that was our episode on the current state of giant, massive comic book events. Like I said, they do still have problems. Many of the problems I talked about in that video years ago, they still exist. In fact, there are even some new problems. However, they're not as bad as they used to be. And I wanted to come in here and make this video today because ever since I made that video years ago, whenever a giant, massive comic book event gets announced, people always come to me and go, oh, you must hate this. Oh, here come all those problems that you hate. And I wanted to come in here, I wanted to stop and point out, no, they have definitely improved. They are not nearly as bad as they used to be. Even if they still have problems, it is important to stop and point at something when it's getting better. If you never acknowledge when something is getting better, things will only get worse. So that's what I wanted to do in today's episode. I will admit there were times in which I was even making this episode, in which I had those doubts in my head, in which I thought to myself, oh man, maybe they actually haven't gotten better. Like, I remember I was looking up all the tie-in books for War of the Realms, and I thought to myself, oh man, I forgot that tied in with the Avengers. I forgot tie-in with Fantastic Four. I forgot that there was a tie-in book in Iron Man for it. Oh man, they did have way more tie-ins than I expected them to have. Oh man, maybe giant massive crossover events haven't gotten better. But then I looked at Secret Empire, which was probably the biggest crossover event that we had before War of the Realms. And oh my god, it's not even close. It was so much worse back then than what we have now. Things definitely have improved over the past couple of years, and where they are right now, yeah, I can live with this. Even if I still have those problems, listen, you're always going to have some problems when it comes to comic books. You're always going to have problems when it comes to anything out there. But where we are right now with giant massive crossover events, it's not so bad. I can actually live with this. There will still be problems, but there are definitely improvements, and you do need to point out the improvements. That's what I wanted to do today. But thank you guys very much for tuning in to another episode of Comic Class. If you were interested in Beef Bros, then check out the description to the Kickstarter down below. And as always, you guys can follow me around the internet on Twitter and Twitch at Professor Thorgy. And thank you guys very much for tuning in. We took that month off so that we could focus on spooky, scary things for Thorgy-ween. I hope that you guys enjoyed that. But now we're going to be getting back to more regular comic book news. Thank you guys again. Come back next time. Bye.